All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our Conversations on Social Reproduction seminar. Really thrilled this week to have with us Professor Srimati Basu, who's a professor of gender and women's studies and anthropology at the University of Kentucky, presenting on some really fascinating current work that she's been doing. So, Srimati Basu is an interdisciplinary scholar of gender and law, social movements, marriage, and violence in South Asia. She is the author of the monographs The Trouble with Marriage, Feminists Confront Law and Violence in India, and She Comes to Take Her Rights, Indian Women, Property and Propriety, and also an editor of volumes Dowry and Inheritance, the co-editor of Conjugality Unbound, Sexual Economy and the Marital Form in India. And more recently, she's been focusing on masculinity, law, marriage, and violence. And some of this work appears in anthologies, including the 50th anniversary commemorative volume of Contributions to Indian Sociology, so a couple of years ago, and Men and Feminism in India, and in Feminist Anthropology and QED. But she's currently working on a monograph about the anti-feminist men's rights movement in India, which is what I believe she'll be sharing with us today. And during this summer is a visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Germany. And as she just mentioned to us, has started a new fieldwork project on private detectives in India, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and American Institute for Indian Studies. And yeah, so I think you do fieldwork with really fascinating groups, you know, who a lot of us kind of are apprehensive about as feminist scholars. And so you are intrepid in undertaking these conversations with anti-feminist men's activists. So I'll hand it over to you. So you have about 25 minutes, give or take, to speak, and then I'll open it up for questions. So we have about 30 minutes. I'll give you a warning when you're a couple minutes off.
Okay. I was planning on about 30 minutes, so I will try to go as fast as possible.
Yeah. You play by ear. We can.
And thank you so much, Prabha, for inviting me, and Liz for setting it up. And Shakti, it's so lovely to see you again. And I also see this the great benefit of presenting from being in this time zone as opposed to either India or the US, because I see so many folks from India, yay, on our Teams, Microsoft Teams, and folks from across England as well. So this is lovely. So I'm going to, as I was just telling Shakti, this is I'm working on this book on men's rights groups, which is called tentatively something like Asserting Vulnerability, politics and lives of Indian men's rights activists. But I think the thing that I'm going to present today is like a piece of figuring out what that asserting vulnerability means. So I would love to hear from you how you think about that and where we might place it. And all this in these last few weeks, I've been also working on a piece on kinship, etc., which might as well be, that's just as much about social reproduction. But here I want to maybe think about ideology and public health and where this is going. So I will start with a picture of a common November. So November sees this as fluorescence of much facial hair across the spectrum of men who campaign for gender equity. So you can see here, choose your weapon, a non-lethal weapon, but in a war of, I don't know, beauty or handsomeness, that both evokes and jokes about the heroic act. It is not, right? So in November, sorry, I keep all the lobby things are coming this way. But so in India, Farhan Akhtar, renowned as the UN Women's Goodwill Ambassador for his Mard initiative, dons his feminist mustache, Marty's Men Against Rape and Discrimination, and he is an ambassador for the UN's He for She initiative. He grows his feminist mustache, and men's rights groups grow their, wait, stuck. 1 second. Sorry, am I stuck in? Sorry. So men's rights groups here grow their anti-feminist mustaches, right? So in anti-feminist solidarity, they're protesting against unfair laws of custody, alimony, etc. So, I've been trying to think of what is it that the mustache means, the hairy lip, an icon of masculinity in various cultural contexts, seems an elusive signifier for a commitment to pro and anti-feminism, right? We might think of it as, I said, a synecdochal referent of gender difference, right? To mark gender difference, but it is just as much a reminder of a gender continuum, given that, there's of course, no necessary relationship between mustache growing and biological sex. Any of us can and have done it, right? So rather than ennobling it as a form of shaving discipline, like the nationalist body or the wrestler's body in Joseph Walter's work, we might plainly think of it as something those assigned masculinity can easily do. For example, Shayan Bhattacharya has an article from a long time ago in Kindle. He talks about this mustache growing as a metonymic embodiment of the phrase "Main hu na," I'm there for you, right? Where the mustache stands for assured protection from either conservative or progressive men. Shayan calls it a protectionist attitude that contributes to the culture of violence. So similarly, I think a number of global organizations make fuzzy claims to promote men's issues, such as these mustache campaigns. And so here we get into this world of women's health. So MRAs, as I said, grow their men's rights activists grow their mustaches as part of a politics of solidarity and for recognition of men's rights. But they, of course, abhor Farhan Akhtar's pro-feminist mustache. Akhtar's mission was to raise awareness against rape and gender inequality, using his movie star status to brand the mustache itself as a sign of solidarity with feminist causes. And we can talk about that some more. So he one time distributed 70,000 mustaches to the audience of a 2013 IPL cricket match in Kolkata. He was deemed the UN Women Ambassador because of his organization's outreach to men, part of this very awkwardly named He for She initiative of the UN. So an extensive enterprise includes everything from, it has its own Pantone color, it has endorsements from, Barack Obama, Matt Damon, and, all sorts of sort of policy things. So, but famously, the mustache is most prominent in the November, as a brand, in the November Modes for Bros campaign. I urge you all to go look at it. It is totally entertaining. So it originally targeted awareness of prostate cancer in Australia, but it now is a more global event, includes other men's health issues such as testicular cancer, depression, etc. So it's, kind of a men's equivalent of breast cancer marketing. The mustache, also coded through ornamentation, beauty, sexiness, doesn't, quite serve as a parallel to breast cancer marketing. There is no equivalent to the ways that breast cancer campaigns flip the semiotics of the sexy breast in popular culture, for example. But the mustache becomes, sort of solipsistic and performative. So scholars who have studied Movember, there are several of them, have found that people get most involved in the mechanics of the challenge, like how good is your mustache, how does it take, and in recruiting other people rather than this connection to health. But nonetheless, it keeps rising as a symbol. So today, I want to consider some of the embodied practices and affective registers through which global men's rights movement, so sorry, the writing is so small, in particular the Indian version gains visibility. So in the popular imagination, right, MRAs are dominant and potentially violent men, textbook examples of R.W. Connell's phrase, hegemonic masculinity, ideas of masculinity in a given time or place that express dominant values over femininity and over forms of marginalized masculinity. So in India, such hegemonic masculinity might include militarized heroes, Modi's performance of masculine masculinity, as Sanjay Srivastava discusses, as one of the signature axes of Hindutva dominance, right? And so Joseph Alter has a wonderful genealogy of masculinities from wrestlers to the Gandhian body to the rugged Himalayan survivor, as a spectrum of embodied negotiations with the norm. And so it's common that MRM, men's rights movement, that is, discourses often align with hegemonic discourses of patriarchal privilege, familial or economic power, and with global alt-right groups who advocate radical individualism, more on whom in a second. But what I want to show you today is some of the ways they evoke masculinity in other ways, as an important one being within the language of human rights and gender equity, identified as the dominant discourse of inclusion and hence of financial resources in our times. So I'm going to talk about MRA strategies of embodiment that undermine the power of hegemonic masculinity by inhabiting the playful, the ridiculous, the abject, the passive as the basis for political claims and legal process and social space. That is, they simultaneously benefit by leveraging the ways that the vulnerable, unmasculine body can help shore up political advantages within certain global movements, and simultaneously anti-feminist or misogynist discourses which draw from broader ideas of threatened masculinity. So just a very, very quick background on my project on the men's rights movement. So much of this fieldwork was in 2013-14, as Shalini was just recalling. So I hung out with men's rights groups across about 8 Indian cities, interviews, weekly meetings, etc. See if I have a picture. So many people have studied these groups through either legal cases, sort of afraid of their violence, and I fully appreciate that moment. But I had been curious about them because of my previous research on about the sort of intertwined impact of civil and criminal law, right? So domestic violence charges, here's the set of laws here. Can you all see? Okay. So domestic violence charges are commonly used by judges, mediators, police, and litigants in negotiations of alimony. I've talked a bunch about this before, but just to rehearse that thing. The logic was that the criminal threat of jail time, job loss, and social embarrassment was leveraged for better settlements in civil alimony, which typically is more gender neutral and doesn't yield as many rewards, right? That it would create more negotiating power. So according to me, it's both a treacherous path and, it sort of covers over the issue of violence to make it more of a civil issue, right? An issue of negotiating alimony, which, arguably is the strategic cause we are going towards. So the MRM criticizes this legal strategy of filing simultaneous and civil and criminal complaints, as they call it, rampant misuse by unscrupulous, I'm quoting, by unscrupulous women to extort money and harass their husband's extended family. They talk about it as the gift hamper that comes with their divorces, etc. So, they're misogynist rants, so the attribution of bad faith to all feminists and indeed all women make it a challenge to hear them sympathetically. But there are manifest problems with the strategic use of criminal law and its instrumental use by police and lawyers. And I see several people here who have argued the same thing, given that families on either side can essentially be, extorted by the police, the corrupt law enforcement. So it just creates a really bad, has the potential and often does create really bad situations, right? And so I've talked to various feminist organizations and women lawyers organizations who think that this thing is necessary. They say that, but they're also, often really irritated that this is taking over the ways in which they can serve their clients. This perception of misuse, that various other people have written about this. I won't go into that. So, I thought I was going in, as in other movements in other countries, including in England, to meet a few disaffected fathers, etc. But, I was really surprised to find at that time, which arguably was the height of the movement, that there were, hundreds of people would show up at different meetings. This was also the time the Matrimonial Property Act was going through, so it was connected to that. I won't talk about that today. But interestingly, we can discuss about whether this is a backlash movement or not. I don't think the word, don't think the word backlash contains the way in which feminism is both a kind of a mirror and a kind of a goal for this movement. But it also, all these hundreds of people were showing up at the same time that the Matrimonial Property Bill was potentially about to come up as a parliamentary discussion, and also at the time that there were, agitations following around rape in Delhi, around the hostel movement, around the 377 bill, etc. So I'm going to show you very quickly. This is not going to go as well as usual given our screens, but I'll give it a shot. So this is where suddenly I found myself in contact with the Indian men's rights movement, 30 years ago. In 1992, I was working on my dissertation work on inheritance. And, someone came around the Indian Law Institute Library handing out these pamphlets. I'll just read them out a little bit to you. So this is by Comrade R.P. Chok. He describes himself as a pro bono professor, whatever that is. So this is a campaign to prevent cruelty against husbands through a platform he names the Akhil Bharatiya Patni Atyachar Virodhi Manch. So the All India Forum in Opposition to Torture by Wives. So it contends that dowry and torture of wives are deceptive excuses for marital discord, leaving husbands and their families devastated, etc. So you can't, from what you can see of the image, this has more pictures than words. I have a lot to say about these images elsewhere, but I'll just quickly tell you that there is often this kind of image of a fat woman strangling like a scrawny man, or as you'll see in this set of images, a lot of sort of women leaving their families devastated. In the last image on the right, you see this, the husband being eaten alive by vultures that represent laws and police and whatever, right? I remind you again, I got this thing very serendipitously in 1992. So, and that is the faint beginnings of the act. I have realized over the years, they've sort of done some actions like that. In 2005, when the Domestic Violence Act was passed, they reconstituted themselves, became a group, became an internet group, eventually transitioned to groups that met in person. And maybe that 2013-14 was kind of the height of the movement because of all the action around trying to reformulate how 498 was treated in the courts and police, and also around the Matrimonial Property Act. So, this is the time they also begin to draw attention. This is, reporters begin to carry this. I point out to you how, it's like the hand connoted female and the guy on the string connoted male, and how it carries that message. But I do want to show you the names of some of the organizations in these cities, right? Here's a selection. Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Men, Child Rights Initiative for Shared Parenting, Pirito Purush Poti Porishad, that is Oppressed Men's and Husbands Group, Purusha Hakka Sanrakshan, the Protection of Rights for Men. All of them, as you can see, evoke men, children, and family as the thing that they are protecting. So the names of the women's groups are the Forgotten Women's Association and Mothers and Sisters Initiative, or MASI, the word for aunt in several Indian languages. And if you wonder who the forgotten women are, they are the sisters and mothers of these men who are going through divorce, who allegedly are forgotten by feminists. Here's a poster So finally, I have figured out that this is supposed to, I always was like, why is this Japanese woman here? But it's supposed to represent different religious groups, I guess. So, and I should say, especially as a preface to what I'm about to show you, that the media often covers the leaders of these movements who are often middle class, upper caste, etc. But in fact, you could easily see at any meeting that a number of sort of poorer men come around. They're kind of taken care of by the others, and that groups they see themselves very importantly as a homosocial circle that give each other life and visibility. So I've written elsewhere about how they are sort of functioning alternate communities of homosociality around that, right? And I, again, also won't belabor the point about the kinds of things they do, but their mobilization strategies include political work, lobbying Congress people, participating in elections, and very importantly, kind of literacy work. So working through the internet of, going with targeted search engines, creating certain kinds of literacies. But they're also very interested in participating in civic action. So this is International Men's Day, a langar, a charitable meal held in Old Delhi. This is Men's Day in Kolkata with a cake and a banner. And this is a participation in the Mumbai marathon, right? So folks also are very, media is super important to them, how pictures are and information is seeded in presentations, for example, how their phone number shows up, what they put forward, including some of you sent me some lovely stuff on the marriage strike earlier this year. The MRA's call to the marriage strike, etc. So all of that is part of the media strategy, right? And another thing to know about them is most of the leaders here, right, are typically in their mid to late 20s to early 40s, right? Often they've lost their jobs because of having to run around to, all these various legal encounters. Very often they are unable to marry. They're sometimes voluntarily holding off divorce, etc. So they see themselves as a kind of burdened group, right? So without further ado, I will move on to talk of embodiment, right? So back to the mustache. The mustache for today's talk is one of the forms of embodiment through which the MRM frames its plight in structures its alignment with a range of civil society and health, political and social movement groups, right? So as you see, these affective registers of vulnerable masculinity help the MRM frame their stance through rights discourse in terms of law and policy. Meanwhile, it carries along a misogyny in other kinds of ways. So here are a few other practices where men consciously counter hegemonic figures to make a point about pathos, right? So MRAs say they spurn sugar at their annual meeting because their lives lack sweetness. So they held a gamcha rally. For those of you who don't know, it's kind of this thin cloth checked towel. I have a couture version of that. That's Antonio Banderas, of course. So that is gamcha fashion, but these men held a gamcha rally to show that as extorted husbands, the gamcha is all they are left with. And famously, they held a sari rally in which they perfectly demonstrate the sari both as a symbol of emasculation and powerlessness, and contrarily, as a symbol of the power of feminists. Believing that since a man's voice is never heard, they had to turn into women. That's what it says on there. But you can also see, this is early in the farmers' protest. This is from Tamil Nadu. An example of the sari as feminization used in farmers' protest, right? In which they say that, this is a Reuters image, which says, the government has made us into women. So here again, women are both objects of envy as recipients of government programs and by implication, less deserving recipients of them. So, vulnerability similarly appears as a theme in a number of MRA worldviews. Here's an example of a person saying he's the leader of one of the local organizations who says we want to be human, we don't want to be muscular, right? So this is the sort of one version of it. I won't read this whole thing to you, but in another quote, someone else from Bangalore points out some of a girl playing out around us and talks about, the lifelong repressive socialization of boys, right? Rather trenchantly Freudian, I thought, in its depiction of hard-won, painful rise to childhood, the establishment of patriarchal hierarchy. So the prison of patriarchy is seen to disproportionately repress boys and ask too much of them. Note that gender disparities of resources or privilege do not figure in these equations, right? And I won't go into this, but Michael Messner has worked on US men's groups who started like that, who started looking at gender role and then moved very quickly into misogyny, while the whole discourse of power kind of fell away. So here is a super important image for us. So consider Superman in his recasting of masculinities as caring, playful fathers who have rights, in contrast to the patriarchal figure of authority. Here, I would say a tubby man whose Superman costumes invokes, to my eyes, pity and pathos rather than tragedy, right? His costume is hyper literal in that he is Superman, emphasis on man. His superpower is his devoted fatherhood. So sometimes people laugh at his face because he doesn't look like Superman, but the impeccable body of the superhero, but he's not doing it to be funny, right? The fatherhood signified here is marked not as patriarchal authority, but as a new register of participatory involved parenting, perhaps a reflection of changing global norms in fatherhood, which we can also talk about. And notably, this picture, for example, emphasizes affective fatherhood and eludes questions of the materialities of child rearing in terms of labor or time or resources, right? Another thing I know you folks have been talking about. So in Superman and the Sari Rally, we might identify the concept of what Pascoe and Bridges famously call hybrid masculinity. So men's selective incorporation of performance and identity elements associated with marginalized and subordinated masculinities and femininities. Dimitri also talks about that hegemonic masculinities are always kind of hybridizing, appropriating, etc. So you can see in this example, the Superman body or the liberal notion of the caring, involved father meshes with the heroic notion of the father who will risk anything, no matter how ridiculous, to have access to his children, transforming kind of the hegemonic notion of the father as the distant provider. Even more importantly, you see behind him, they are taken from an exhibition for Men's Day in Bengaluru. Other pictures in this exhibition behind him, as explained to me, are a male beggar that they say is abandoned by his family, a mime performing kind of abjection, and a gaucho, in their words, a cowboy, kicking up dust, signifying the self-destructive quality of macho ideology. So the person who was showing me around this said about the gaucho, Argentinian figure, said, if cornered, men don't give a damn to anything, connecting it to men who now refuse to get married because of how laws are being used. So they choose social chaos, etc. So in other words, these images are offered together to highlight masculinity in terms of its harms to men, of gender roles as destructive to men, and of the distress produced by political economy on men as a category. So I won't go into it a whole bunch, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that here the men's rights groups are actually evoking a lot of the recent public health research on disparities in men's health, right? So of higher mortality, higher suicide rates, higher kind of non-communicable diseases and death, etc., right? So here's one image of that. In and typically, like in this Lancet article that quotes the UN, it's connected to masculinity in failure to health seek, the gendering of occupations that are seen to be more dangerous to health, in riskier behaviors that are connected to masculinity. But you'll see that in so here I identify some of these causes of vulnerability, but you'll see that in more recent treatments, folks are kind of saying like this, telling men in a kind of scolding voice that masculinity is harmful and don't do it isn't working, and they're probably trying to look at other kinds of research that would other kinds of interventions, like more active interventions. So Ahana Roy has some very beautiful research on reporting on these projects in India that are trying to build other forms of leadership, right? But I do want to say that suicide is a favorite the disparity in suicide rates, right? The fact that men are overwhelmingly higher in number as suicide victims is one of the big talking points, right? Whenever I talk to men's rights groups, they would point out to me that 60,000 married men in India commit suicide each year. And so initially I would be, inclined to say, well, because married women's suicides have been so overwhelmingly connected to marriage, family violence, demands connected to dowry, etc., that you could argue that married women's suicides are often connected to marriage, right? But you could say, well, men's suicides aren't connected to marriage in the same way. But you can see, if you look at the sort of numbers around what men's suicides are connected to, that it does indeed have to do with this same kind of the burden of provider responsibilities, right? The taking on of sort of behaviors or family in a certain kind of way, right? And that it has to do with the political economy of certain jobs declining, certain meaningful forms of community building that people have lost, growing isolation, etc. So, so it's not unconnected, right, to the question of gender roles. But the really important point I want to make here, so you can see that this is taken on in, I think this is from the Guardian, yeah, connects to this sort of discourse. But the problem here is that these claims are lodged in a kind of fundamental difficulty with gender equity issues, right? Even when it purports to be pro-feminist and in global health policies. So, there's this need to identify harms of masculinity as a toxic byproduct of patriarchy, but there is an unwillingness to acknowledge the uneven advantages of economic and cultural capital and feminist calls for redistribution of power. So we kind of stay in that mode. So a prevailing problem in organizations that purport to promote men's health and well-being is that gender equity norms are appealed to as a remedy, but in ways that redress perceived imbalances for men without any corresponding change to their privileges. So I'm just going to quickly show you an image of the International Men's Day group, right? So when you initially see it, they're like, our mission is to value men and their families, to praise positive role models. But as you read through, they say their agenda is gender equality, meaning fair treatment of the family quotes. Then you see, or gender gap in education, right? But the organization is explicitly anti-feminist, right? Where it addresses itself to women saying, you take it on and earn those positions based on merit, not on the shape of your genitalia, etc. So you often, all kinds of things that go in the name of men's health actually have something solid at the core of it, and yet, are very quick to lapse into misogyny. So
you have 5 minutes.
Yes, I shall be mostly making my target. So here is the sort of big takeaway there, right? That discourses of men's vulnerability conflate two categories of perceived unfairness. One, legal outcomes in divorce and custody cases, and two, inequalities of resources and health, right? So the cases of some MRAs who are angered by losing custody or paying huge alimony settlements come to stand as exemplars of unfairness with, I mean, at that point, there is no discussion of women's economic losses following divorce or custodial decisions and their effects on women, etc. So the latter category, inequalities of resources and health, as you all know, pertain to people who lead lives of precarity in the modern state, right? Like you saw in this Superman image and the folks behind him. But they are what, the sociologist Bush calls this the appropriative of discursive capital, right? So MRAs identify with the marginalization of poor men by expanding the category of men, while they simultaneously appropriate the discursive capital of feminists or women, conflating the two, in donning saris, using the sari to project their story, to project their emasculated state, even as they set themselves up in opposition to the identity. So that's the kind of two-step move there. So as you can see, many MRAs who are these leaders don't face this kind of social abandonment, but these images become metonymic of their social abandonment. So I just want to show you a couple of final images here. So they describe the social and legal purgatory of lost jobs, inability to take on romance, etc. So this Rai suggestion of Lakshman just so happens that they meet in Lakshman Park. Lakshman from the Ramayana, who is seen as having lived in exile in the forest for 14 years without his wife who stayed back, right? Or I loved this moment in Bombay where their line for this dog is, he must also be a victim, meaning it interpolates their own identity of victimhood, but it gestures to the few connections they can count on. You must be a victim because you approach, right? That's the argument, given that the only people approaching them are victims or people in trouble, etc. So masculinity is, as you all know, relational, and discourses of masculinity or femininity have the plasticity, right, to be deployed for contradictory advantages. So Mrinalini Sinha has foundationally argued in her work the notion of this effeminate Bengali Babu shaped or helped Anglo-Indians assert the superiority of well-managed masculine colonial governance, while Bengali Bhadralok attempted to claim the slight to their advantage, right? And they could thereby indict colonial rule for causing their emasculation. So both groups elided economically marginal Indians in this binary formulation in Minnie's argument. So here, in our case, ascriptions of the weak and burdened body similarly help constitute political advantage, focus on the rights of husbands and men, making capital of the ridicule or distaste with which they may be regarded in mainstream culture. Now, I won't, in the interest of time, I won't show you when you already got a flavor, right? If we look at the meme culture of this same movement, it is sort of intensely misogynist, right? So at the same time, they are putting these things forward. So I think those two things together, let me just say in conclusion, translate into stances in the men's rights movement where strategic emasculation is wielded to game the logic of patriarchal control by disavowing particular scripts of masculine performance. So this is why I'm toying with the title, Asserting Vulnerability, and thinking about the book. This is one of their images about which we can talk about infinitely, but will not. So you often see that in the ways in which they pose themselves, in the ways, this is an example of legal advice given to people, like don't go for divorce, don't jam the system, jam culture, right? So that is the form of assertion that the vulnerability takes, right? We are going to show you what vulnerability means. And I'll leave you with this last quote from someone who is sort of a textbook example of passive aggressiveness, right? He's like, see, in this case, I call him Anuj. He proposes to remedy having been the neglected, wounded subject of the harm or violence of gender roles by rejecting the wanted features of masculinity, protection, provision, being constituted through violence. So he purports to embrace peace and withdrawal and rather gleefully speculate what a world without gallant masculinity would look like. Is it one that's given over to terrorists or one in which terrorists also quit? Or how will economic systems function if that happens? So the not very veiled challenge is that masculine advantages and inadequate compensation for the greater risk and harm, but essential to replicating economic, political, and social systems. Right? So I just want to end by saying that, I have thought of Gail Rubin famously said about Levi-Strauss's idea that marriage systems constitute circulation of culture by saying, well, we are going to have to change sex gender systems or, come up with something else that's an extermination of culture. I mean, to paraphrase her, I haven't read the whole thing. So it's ironic that this MRM ideology appears to be offering just such a threat. Nihilistic provocations such as this also rest on the assumption that men drive heteronormative culture so much that they are consumed by it, and hence that refusing that role would exterminate men as they are now defined and undo culture altogether. So drawing attention to their vulnerabilities while framed in the language of gender equity and human rights, thus highlights their movement as one that establishes their superior value. Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and really rich. So whoever has questions, in the interest of time, maybe you could all raise your hands and we can take clusters of questions. I have a question too, but I'll pin it on along with. Okay, so.
Shakti, shall I go to stop presenting mode? Then we could have more.
Yeah, sure.
If we want to see some kind of image, we can maybe go back to it.
Okay. So right now, Sripadna has a question. Sripadna, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Hi, Srimati.
Hello.
Lovely.
I know you have much to say. Yeah.
Well, I'll keep it brief. And as you know, a lot of my work has been on health thus far. So that's why I thought that, one thing that I want to bring out is you've used the concept of vulnerability, and vulnerability as it is understood within public health or largely within the health literature may have a different connotation from what you mean over here. So I was wondering whether, you might reconsider the term or something like weapons of the weak or, different modes of resistance, because I wonder whether using vulnerability in this way taints, it is a matter of interpretation, of course, but the way I see, the conceptualization of vulnerability is that it's rooted in certain structural and economic and, sort of in a larger, broader political economy, which disempowers a particular group, right? So for some men, yes, I think what you have described, they are in a particularly vulnerable situation given their caste, class positions, but that may not be broadly true for many women or for many of the others. So,
yeah. So, totally. I want to think about your idea that, at least to signal that it is, that it has a very specific meaning in the literature. So I will think about that. But I just want to say that this, that it's not exactly my word, right? That is, as you know, it is a word in this men's health literature, right? And hence it is a claim by the movement. So I think the struggle is how to claim it and to differentiate it at the same time. I totally agree with you, right? That it is both connected to gender role and it affects only certain people in certain kinds of ways, right? And it affects poor people who have lost their jobs in a totally different way than it affects this, IT guy out there, right? So, yeah. Yes, thank you. More chatting on that soon. Shakti, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if anyone else has. Okay, while people are gathering, I'll just go ahead. So, so in short, so I've been actually writing and thinking about the mustache as well, and the ontology of the mustache, and especially the ethical work done by it. But to go really quickly, so you talk about gender as relational, like referencing Rubin, and I'm also invested in how, you know, being felicitously like engaging in a gift economy either validates your mustache or not. And amongst
My goodness.
amongst Kotis, there was an incident I'll share with you at length later, but where somebody's unethical behavior was attributed to them not only having a mustache, but liking the mustache. So this is with this queer community where having a mustache is like a thing you have to do socially, but liking it makes you a man, you know? So there's a kind of, so there's a whole layer there of what you know, a mustache is not just a physical thing, as you said, it's performatively, you know, there or not based on socially being recognized. So, and in that case, it was interesting. It was somebody cheating someone else of money, which was linked to them liking their mustache. That was the thing I was analyzing was this.
Love that.
That's a horrible person. He always liked his mustache. So, and the ethical work is linked to the material transaction of not only what that money symbolized, but the relationships that person opted out of by stealing it. So anyway, so you touched on materiality, and yeah, so I was thinking both relationally in the sense of gender being a gift of recognition we bestow on each other, but also materially, you know, what made the mustache, whose mustache was realer than another's, you know. But yeah, I'm just going to, so that was my question, gift theory, mustache, Koti.
Yes, I don't know. I'm trying to figure the question.
I think Prabha had you too, and okay. Yeah, Prabha has your question too, but yeah.
But I'll just, you know, echo your example was so interesting in thinking about, again, that Movember thing, right? That it very quickly became, according to these analyses, about liking the mustache and not just, yeah. So, you and I need to talk about how it figures into the gift economy question in these cases. Right. I mean, you can see it in the Farhan Akhtar case, right? Or in the UN type of case as a different sort of movement, right? Or as philanthropy, as, you know, its association or its, you know, metonymic relationship to philanthropy. But in the cases of the too much liking, right? And of the MRA, that is something I would think some more about.
Yeah, no, philanthropy and gifts, yeah. Classical. So Prabha, go ahead. You had your questions.
I think Komal has a question. Maybe read it out, Srimati.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
I can't see any of that.
Oh, okay. I see it. Srimati, should I?
Please.
Apologies, okay. So Komal's question, thanks for this wonderful talk. I have a query since the gender question has the element of caste in the Indian context. Women's movement discourse includes it. Does the men's movement in India have a caste element too? And from where does the men's movement derive its power?
So, Komal, the short answer to your question is that, you know, I mean, I've been trying to write some about explaining this simply is that they do not, in fact, considering that this is contemporary India, have any kind of formulated discourse of caste, and they are sort of resolute in not talking about caste and religion. So I was following some of this marriage strike stuff. And whenever people bring up something that is manifestly religious or pertaining to caste politics, they are often shut down by saying, hey, this is about gender, don't talk about that, right? But we can also, of course, very easily see that the folks who lead the movement are obviously middle class, obviously upper caste, obviously have the privileges of education to come from certain jobs. I mean, by no means is this, I really don't want to give the impression that this is everybody. But, you know, in that caste is connected to certain practices of literacy, access, resources, etc. You can see the imprint of where it comes from, but it is not at all manifest discourse, you know, but you can see it implicitly, right, in how men's privileges are constructed, in the sort of discourse part of that. And I have no answer to where their power comes from, other than, you know, you all know that there is a lot of patriarchal power connected to law and resources and the labor market and all the things that go towards cultural and social capital. And in many of these cases, that is also connected to class and caste power in that way. Although everybody concerned that I talked about would completely dispute that they come from a position of power, but we can we can dispute that. What did Sriparna say?
Sriparna has added a comment. I think the power comes from the backlash against feminist jurisprudence. There have been progressive attempts to dilute several laws.
But, you know, I mean, ultimately, you know, we are not feeling very good about legal decisions this year, or every other year we have a version of not feeling good about them. But they are, after all, a small and not all that powerful group, right? In the grand scheme of things. So I think it's kind of important also to remember that about them. Was that, Prabha, did you still have a question, or were you just passing on?
Yeah. I think it's partly, thanks for a very wonderful paper. It was very, very rich as always. So I think one of the questions, I think it's related to what Komal had brought up, which is about the caste question. I was more curious about the class question and wondered whether the lack of emphasis on the economic issues was related somewhat to the class position of the people who are part of the movement, you know, especially from the images that you've shown, you know, they really don't particularly look like they're even middle class, but at the same time, family law is an arena of private law that engages with people who have assets that are worth fighting about, right? So there's a bit of a, but I think you've partially answered that, but it would be, I just wondered whether that was why there was a lack of, not as much of a focus on economic issues as one might expect. The other question is related to what you just said also about the fact that they are not as mainstream a movement as we would imagine, but actually I wanted you to track or reflect on their movement from being a protest movement in around 2012-13 to now being part of the marital rape litigation front and center. So I'm just very curious about that. And I think finally there's a question, and what this means for an ethical feminist practice of law. Of course, that's $1 million question. And, you know, any kind of thought.
You and I can talk about that for like 200 years.
I know. But especially in light of just say in light of the marital rape litigation, you know, it's just, it would be curious. And I know you've written about this. I just wonder whether anything has shifted in your thinking about it based on, you know, the fact that they're at the heart of this litigation. And I guess finally, just the question around legal consciousness, I just wondered whether it was something that I'm sure you've considered, because some of the vignettes you offered are vulnerability mapped very nicely onto some literature on legal consciousness in terms of, you know, treating the law just as a set of rules that you play with for favorable legal outcomes, but also being sort of, you know, opposing the law at some points, but also being very subject and, you know, weak because of the law. So I just wondered whether the legal consciousness literature is something that you find productive really to explain some of these subject positions. Thanks.
So this is the problem of trying to fit everything into a half-hour talk, but because I did not mean to suggest that they are not super interested in issues of property, right? So I have been writing this other piece on marriage and kinship and property that I shared with Prabha, and any of you who want, I would love to discuss further. So I do think it's very tied to questions of property. If you look at the early media reports, for example, right, they constantly say it's a band of IT professionals, right? That who are seen as the first, including that article that I showed you, who are often talked about as, having stakes, being seen as, sort of ripe for exploitation in the marriage market or whatever. But, so what I, however, saw was that in that time when the Matrimonial Property Act was on, right, they are lots and lots of people came who were not representing wealthy people, who often were extremely marginal, who would come to properties and who were really very afraid of losing their homes. Some people had lost their homes, other people were really afraid of losing their homes. And so that becomes an, Pina Agarwal actually rose up at this point to say, like, hang on, people have different kinds of rights to family property. It's not just through marriage, it's generational rights. There are other forms of, entitlement to it. So the class issues are interesting in that way, that the movement is shaped by class in all the ways that I said about caste, right? But it also takes on these generational property issues as kind of at the heart of it. And I guess in an unresolved way, since nothing happened to the matrimonial property bill, right? So to your other thing, I think the mainstreamness of the movement is quite, is a valid point. The question is, how powerful are they? But they are enough powerful to be prominent and to have a certain value, right? And as I said, they're very smart media-wise, right? So every time something happens, so I have certain friends in Delhi who are known feminist friends who are on their mailing lists, right? So every time something happens, they forward me this thing. And I see that on a regular basis, like not a day goes by when something that we all consider as feminists to be a salient moment, that they are right there in the media, putting something on Twitter, having this conversation going. And as you saw, so they were there at the marital rape hearings with a lawyer, maybe not making the most effective case possible, but it's that visibility and recognition politics. But, so they've been heard, right? People have echoed their things. Members of parliament have said their things, but I mean, I guess I'd see them as less powerful as compared to, the force of the MNS or, I mean, those sorts of, or even something like Love Jihad that seemed like, a relatively small movement, but has a lot of power to affect a lot of people. So I don't know, we could talk about that. Like there's a scale in there that's, yeah. I mean, it's about their issues. It's about their politics. It's a kind of a civil society. It's an attempt to have a civil society movement with, as you said, these legal consciousness things, right? So I do want to talk about the legal consciousness things a lot more in the book, because I do think that a lot of this is about their attitude to law and how you're going to face it. And this whole passive aggressiveness in dealing with law is something that really interests me as a strategy. So I do have that. And yeah, I think the question of ethical feminist practice is a very interesting one, right? Like, what do we take from it while, for all the reasons that Sriparna was saying, being very well aware that there's much violence around all this, right? So for example, Prabha, this will interest you, right? So there is this kind of gender neutrality question they constantly bring up, right? Like, so what are the ways that are harmful? But also, as you know, rape law has been relentlessly opposed as having, by feminists, as having nothing to do with male bodies, right? Now, if we apply, minimally a kind of queer legal theory framework, that seems problematic in all sorts of ways, right? How we think about legal read, I mean, so have various dimensions of various things to think about in this context, right? And so if even in the context of this health and vulnerability thing, it seems important to think about the fact that, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a public health person, I don't know what the answer to it is, but it seems to me that those numbers are indeed showing us something, right? About vulnerability, about danger, about harm, right? But I mean, the problem is, I mean, the issue is that it is attributed to feminists as a problem, but the problem is still a problem, So how we position ourselves with that and in interventions to it, or just to point it out and live with it and show how it's being put back upon feminism is a thing. So.
I think we had a short comment from Ganesh. Any feedback from, do you mean any feedback from the men's rights activists? If you'd like to chime in and ask a question, feel free.
Oh, I see now that I can go into the chat.
And anyone else with questions, please raise your hands or put it in the chat. We'll be around for another 8 minutes or so.
So I just want to say about the question of feedback that in the middle of one interview, so they, I know that they read the stuff, but someone said to me once when I was interviewing them, like, if it's useful to us, we will promote it. So I haven't, I guess it is not useful to them, but I know that they read, because sometimes they say, you worked on that here, my book is coming out. One of these men has written a couple of books, one of them a graphic novel. So yeah, that is the extent of feedback, I must say. But I think, I mean, I'll just say that by way of feedback, I do think, I'm an ethnographer. I am interested in understanding what this subjectivity is. And to tell you the truth, there were plenty of narratives that were, some of the most radicalized men are folks who happen to have gone through, really quite grim situations. So it's interesting to both hold those narratives and understand their effects, and to but also to understand what the effects of those things are. So that is really at its heart the challenge of the project. Okay, I don't see that questions.
Okay, we have a question from Meenakshi Krishnan. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, and thanks, Srimati, for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry, my internet connection was a bit unstable, so I might have missed a few things. I was curious on the angle of intersectionality and how much in the masculinity literature, because I'm very unfamiliar with it, honestly, does this play up? So we did refer to the caste and class question, but the way the feminist movement really is now increasingly focusing on sort of the intersectionality lens, and the fact that women's experiences are so heterogeneous and not homogeneous. Does this men's movement recognize that, because or do they try to build, movement across distinctions to gain more power? So how do they engage with the class, caste, or even all kinds of divisions, and even within the same class and caste, the whole experience? Because, like you said, some men are genuinely probably at the receiving end of some of these laws. So how do they find that space and solidarity across this sort of intersectional divides?
So I do think, Meenakshi, that it is, it is overwhelmingly middle class folks in it, right? But they seem, very kind of genuinely as much of a cross-class group as they can be, depending on who comes their way, and they're quite generous about their resources, etc. Right? So, but my bigger point that's the ethnographic point, right? The theoretical point is that, that the fact that economically marginalized men are indeed marginalized, or related to suicide or related to problems, is sort of appropriated by a middle class group for on other kinds of social capital, right? So I think both of those things are true, right? But I should say that since feminism uses intersectionality so much, I would say the masculinity studies literature actually uses a lot. I mean, intersectionality is a very common framework, particularly because of labor, ethnicity, age, so all of those frameworks. In fact, when I look, I've been sort of working on adding that literature into the stuff I'm writing. And it is actually every person who writes an article on masculinity attaches some kind of, adjective to it that hails one thing or the other. So I do think that that's true, but that's a different question than whether the men's groups do it. I should say that the thing that I was pointing out is probably more prominent in the Indian movement than in any account of any other movement I have seen. I mean, I don't want to make any overreaching claims for it that it's not there, right? Because most people have not indeed gone chasing after these folks like I thought I could, but because most things are based on court cases, right? So we don't know like who was there, what happened. But I should tell you all that I think Mangala Subramaniam and a co-author wrote this piece saying that among men's groups, the Indian movement is often reputed to be one of the most innovative and well-organized ones, to go back to Prabha's point. So because of, this marriage strike Twitter war and, this funeral they had some years ago. So it is part of the politics that they have figured out, to highlight, to according to me, to insert themselves into this global politics of men's health and, as Sriparna was saying, vulnerability literature and public health. So it's something they have consciously done.
Sriparna, did you have another question? Or?
I just had a comment to make, and Srimati, as you know, I've just begun working on voluntary childlessness in India, and one of the things that I see in the child-free groups, often posted by men, and even with interviews with men that I have encountered, is parallels to what some of the things that you were saying, right? So this kind of selective appropriation of feminist ideologies and practices, right? So these are men who don't want to have children, they don't want to reproduce the heteronormative family, they're going against the received wisdom of patrilineal kind of extensions, etc. So my expectation when I started off was that, oh, how nice, and they're going to be so liberal and so open, and then I started seeing all these very misogynistic comments about how sort of women are not willing to engage in sexual intimacies with them, and then sort of lots of girl bashing and women bashing as a result of it. And in fact, some of the men themselves, while they might be selectively what we might understand as being progressive on certain accounts, they're definitely regressive when it comes to other caste and class based issues. So it's rather interesting to see how there is this kind of selective appropriation of feminist ideologies and methods in these what some people call menace groups as well.
I am so excited to talk to you more about these reactions. We have to do that. But let me just say one thing in closing out. I know Shakti has a timer on, but that I mean, this is kind of this moment to go back to actually to Shakti's question, is that there are these moments in these groups, right, when you're looking at some of these discourse, you're like, woohoo, they are challenging compulsory heteronormativity, yay! I did this talk on the movies they recommend, which I'm also writing up for this chapter, where this the person I was working with, the editor, talked about this group as ungay queers, right? As folks who are messing up this system in the way that, we assume Lauren Berlant would kind of, like she talks about these alternative plots of intimacy, because they are like, we don't want to deal with women, we just want to be with men, we want to be with each other, but hey, we are straight, right? So, so this, sort of ties into how we think about them as part of the project of compulsory reproduction and heteronormativity, right? I mean, this back to Prabhat's question also, like, where does this fall in ethical feminist practice? You're like, yay, woo. If you look at I was just looking yesterday at all the tweets from the marriage strike, and how many people were like, we will not marry, and how many feminists were like, yay, excellent, we are all for the marriage strike, right? So where do we locate ourselves in this? Like, I think, yeah, you want to be in homosocial spaces and not marry, woo-hoo, who are we to put these people back in the circuit of marriage? Because why? So, yeah. Good. That was a nice rounding off of several things. And
Yeah,
people, please be back in touch with all the questions that you had. I see several of you here that I haven't talked to in a while.
Yeah, I think there's, it seems still like we're just scratching the surface, and in the questions you adeptly addressed all the issues and touched on many more. So it's just like many directions to take. So yeah, we really look forward to being in touch and hoping this generates a community of dialogue and conversation. Excellent. That remains. So for all of you attending, yeah, please join the mailing list and keep coming, and share your work if you want to share it with the group. Okay, all right.
And see some of you in Lisbon.
Okay.
We'll be there.
Bye.
Bye.